All right, everybody, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Bill Drew, Administrator. Our guest today is Jim Lobe. He's the Chief of InterPress Service's Washington D.C. Bureau, where he has been writing about foreign policy for almost 25 years. Mr. Lobe has been writing about the peculiar new brand of interventionists, the Neoconservatives, since before September 11th. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you.
What exactly is a neoconservative?
Well, a neoconservative actually isn't all that new. It goes back about 30 years, in some cases a little more. It tends to be someone who follows a kind of core of thinking that is the most influential ideologue of which is Irving Kristol, who doesn't write very often these days, but his son is much better known as Bill Kristol, who's the editor of the Weekly Standard, which is a very influential neoconservative journal, much read in Washington. And he's also the chairman of something called the Project for the New American Century. And he also appears frequently on network television. I think he's a commentator for both ABC and Fox, so I'm not sure about the latter. I think there's a kind of core of beliefs, but neoconservatism essentially are former liberals or people who are even to the left of kind of liberal Democrats. Irving Kristol himself was a Trotskyite in his youth, and there are a number of former Trotskyites who are associated with the movement, although it's often difficult to say that it's a movement because it conceives itself pretty much as an elite enterprise. And they began to separate themselves from the Democratic Party beginning in the late 60s and then accelerating in the early 70s, so that by 1976, when Jimmy Carter won the nomination to run as the Democratic presidential candidate, they pretty much moved into the Republican Party. The reasons for their rightward movement date back essentially to the 60s, in that they were very appalled by what they referred to as the New Left, and also the rise of the Black Power movement, particularly on university campuses where many neoconservatives taught, or people who were to become neoconservatives. Their main problem was that they thought that both movements, both the New Left and the Black Power movement, were very hostile to Israel, particularly after the 1967 war. And they tagged these movements, they charged these movements with being anti-Semitic. And they felt that the way the Democratic Party was going after Humphrey's defeat in 1968, that the Democratic Party was taking on more and more of the characteristics of the New Left and of the Black Power movement. And both in terms of their attacks on Israel for not giving back territory, for not negotiating, and the sense that the Black Power movement in particular was kind of threatening the position of Jews in universities, in the sense that Jews had long fought the idea of quotas because they had been a victim of quotas prior to the 60s. That is, many elite universities and colleges in the United States had a Jewish quota which kept the numbers down who could enter university or college on merit. And once those quotas were eliminated, Jewish representation went way up, both in faculty and in student bodies. And that was kind of their conception of what civil rights should be all about, is abolishing distinctions, abolishing quotas. Whereas the Black Power movement was very much in favor of a more of affirmative action, of devoting specific residence halls, specific curricula to black studies, and so on. It was seen by many Jews as a throwback to a new segregationism. that they felt very threatened by, and they felt betrayed their own interest in leadership in the civil rights movement. And so for all of these reasons, they began moving rightward. And that really accelerated in the 1972 period when McGovern won the nomination, because with McGovern they saw someone who was essentially an isolationist in their view, and one who was not as committed to the security of Israel, for example, and felt that if the United States did indeed withdraw from Vietnam or from other kind of international commitments, it would leave Israel very exposed to its neighbors. And then in 1973, with another Arab-Israeli war, the Yom Kippur War, and the Arab oil embargo that followed, plus the denunciations of Israel at the United Nations, this all very much accelerated their move to the right, and it's what's behind now their real contempt for the United Nations, their distrust of multilateral institutions, their enormous dislike for Saudi Arabia, much of which I would say is warranted. But in any event, they saw the Democratic Party as moving further and further away from them to the extent that it became more and more sympathetic to these ideas of the UN, multilateralism, and so on and so forth. And they moved further and further to the right. So that by the time of Ronald Reagan's election, they were almost without exception allied very much behind Reagan, and many of them got jobs, and some quite significant jobs, in the Reagan administration, and they were quite powerful, particularly in the first term of the Reagan administration, pretty much until Iran-Contra. In 88, they were much less enthusiastic about George Bush Sr. because he was seen as a realist, not nearly as ideological as they, not nearly as committed to Israel and Israel's security. And that fear kind of came to pass in the wake of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, when Bush very strongly pressured the then Likud leadership of Israel to enter into the Madrid negotiations, which really formed the basis later of Oslo. Bush himself, Senior Bush, really did not like neoconservatives because he thought, for the most part, that they were kind of dangerous and they did not share his ideas about what a realistic foreign policy is. And most of the people who were working in the Reagan administration at that time and who were neoconservatives left the administration. And the most prominent exception was Wolfowitz, who's currently the Deputy Defense Secretary, Paul Wolfowitz. He was working for Dick Cheney, who was then Defense Secretary. So that's some of the origins. But they've never had as much power as they've had under Bush II since 9/11.
Okay, well, before we get to exactly what they've been up to since September 11th, I want to ask you a little bit more about the background here.
Sure.
So, if I understand you right, this is really more of a group than a philosophy. It's an actual
I think you can,
set of individuals.
I think what you can say is it's a network of very like-minded people, which has been kind of on the Washington scene for a long time, which has acquired a lot of political skills, a lot of contacts in the media, and who really are able to exercise quite an influence in Washington, way out of proportion to their actual numbers. I should also stress that not all neoconservatives are Jews, that there are a number of prominent Protestant and Catholic neoconservatives who have been with the Jewish neoconservatives from the beginning, in part for the same reasons. A lot of it, I think, has to do with a sense of moral obligation or responsibility toward Israel in the wake of the Holocaust. The Holocaust being seen as kind of the absolute evil, and that it simply can never afford to happen again. And so you have a number of pretty prominent Gentile thinkers who have accepted that and who now argue that the fate and the values of Israel and the United States are the same. Bill Bennett is a very prominent exponent of that position, as is, for example, I've got a mental block now because I'm aging so quickly, but Novak at American Enterprise Institute, a very prominent
Michael Novak,
theologian.
Right? Not Bob
Michael
Novak.
Yes. No, certainly not Bob Novak.
Right.
Very hostile to the neoconservatives. Although quite friendly to Richard Pearl, for example. Novak, Gene Kirkpatrick, James Lobe, these are all people who really feel a strong sense of moral obligation to Israel and Jewish people, I think, in general. And they strongly, they believe in this general worldview. They accept
So
it.
do they call themselves neoconservatives? Do they see themselves as this cohesive group? I know that Irving Kristol has called himself that, but I wonder about...
Well, they kind of have accepted it over time. In part, I think the fact that Kristol accepted it was fairly decisive, because I think Kristol's influence really is the most important single influence. And in many ways, he was espousing what became neoconservative views already in the 50s, but he was a kind of lone voice at that time.
How many of these are connected to Trotskyist roots? You mentioned Irving Kristol's involvement with the Trotskyists. And also I wonder about I've heard so much in connection with these neocons about a professor named Strauss at the University of Chicago. And my understanding is he wasn't a Trotskyist, right? This is sort of a mixture of the Trotskyists and the Straussians, or?
Well, you see, I don't know. I mean, this is a complicated issue, and I'm not really a follower of sectarian left politics. And I think to understand all the ins and outs, you really have to kind of know the history of the various split-offs of Trotskyite groups over the last 60 years or 70 years. And I'm not an expert on that at all. There are people who are much more knowledgeable about that. But my basic understanding is that Kristol was definitely, in his youth, a Trotskyite, considered himself a Trotskyite. And that the Trotskyites, again, through a variety of kind of sectarian splits over a period of time, many Trotskyite groups really became very strongly pro-U.S., and many of them were in the labor movement, and who really believed that instead of Soviet communism as being kind of the vanguard of the revolution, it really was the AFL-CIO who should be seen as the vanguard of revolution around the world. And there were a number of people who certainly began as Trotskyites, who became followers of somebody named Max Schachmann, who was a very charismatic socialist leader, originally a Trotskyite, who created a number of different splinter groups, some of whom, like Young Socialist League, attracted very talented, initially left-wing, predominantly Jewish activists, mainly from New York, of my generation, which would be like the 60s generation. People like Elliot Abrams, people like Joshua Moravchik, like Linda Chavez, who wasn't Jewish, to my knowledge. Like Gene Kirkpatrick was involved in this in the 50s already. And they, Carl Gershman, who's head of the National Endowment for Democracy, and a number of others. And these were all had their roots in kind of in Trotskyite thinking and Trotskyite organization. But their politics are very right-wing at this point. They still meet as socialists, as young socialists in some cases, or also as Social Democrats USA is another group which included many of the people I just named, and which really came to be dominated by them, certainly by the 70s.
And Wolfowitz and Pearl, their professor Albert Wohlstetter was one of these Trotskyites too, right?
No, I don't know about that. I'm not sure. There's a lot of rumor about Wohlstetter. I mean, the New York Times reported that he was a Straussian, and although they taught at the same university, as far as anyone could tell, they didn't particularly know each other. I think the Straussian connection is a bit exaggerated in the sense that, again, and according to a New York Times article by James Atlas, like, there were so many neocons who had some Straussian connection. I thought that was a very shoddy article. I think, like Wohlstetter, I think a number of people who are named in that really know absolutely nothing about Strauss. They've never read a word. Strauss is a very esoteric writer, and very difficult to get through if you just try to read him. But I think people were quite surprised when Crystal said at a speech at American Enterprise Institute about 10 years ago that Strauss was one of the two major thinkers who had affected his own views. And Bill Crystal did study under Straussians at Harvard. There are others like Charles Fairbanks, who has contributed to various neoconservative study groups and things like that, who's very much in a Straussian, is very Straussian in the sense that he studied under Straussians and very important Straussians. And there does seem to be a kind of cult around people who study Strauss. But I think in terms of general neoconservative thinking, I still think that Crystal Irving is the dominant character, and to the extent that he reflects the views of that Strauss came to be understood as supporting, then obviously he would have passed those views along without necessarily crediting them. So I think there are probably Straussians out there who think that they're simply followers of Crystal, or you can call them Crystallites if you like, but who actually have absorbed, some of the things that Strauss believed. Strauss is a very controversial figure, as you know.
Well, and the significance of this is that he's the guy who wrote all about the noble lie and took very much Plato's view that the philosopher kings have to rule everybody else with an iron fist, sort of the Thomas Hobbes kind of, they're not good enough to be free kind of attitude, right?
Yeah, but that's the main, what shall we say, liberal critique of Strauss that's come to be increasingly accepted by other political philosophers. But he believed part of the noble lie was to not make clear what your real program was and what you said and what you wrote. So, as I understand it, a lot of Strauss requires very, very close textual readings and being able to read between the lines, often with help from older Straussians, in a sense. In other words, there's a kind of written tradition of Strauss which seems not particularly objectionable, and then there's a kind of oral tradition of Strauss which reflects more the views that you're talking about, I think. But I'm not a political philosopher. I don't even report on political philosophy, so I'm a little reluctant to go very far out on a limb. I just think a lot of the people who are neoconservative probably owe a lot of their thinking to Strauss, but they credit Crystal because they don't know who Strauss is particularly.
Right. And the significance of the Trotskyite, the former Trotskyite thing is forgive me if I'm drawing conclusions here, but it seems like they've carried very much their ideas of permanent revolution from Trotsky, and I think what Max Boot called hard Wilsonianism, where the typical Wilsonian tradition was to make the world safe for democracy at gunpoint, and their way is just like that, only more so.
Well, you see, I question the degree to which neoconservatives are committed to democracy. I mean, it's something they've espoused very strongly, particularly lately, and they certainly see themselves in opposition to totalitarianism. But in terms of fundamental democratic values, I think they use, my own feeling is that they they use that as a way of swaying people to whatever side they're supporting. I have not been able to see consistency on the question of human rights and democratic rule. I don't see them propounding those positions on a consistent basis over 35 years. I just don't. I mean, they've defended some really outrageous and frankly anti-Semitic movements and governments. So I don't know that that's part of their core ideology.
Well, and
I think most of them believe that
it's hard to spread democracy with force. That's not a very democratic way to make people a democracy by killing them. So it sort of dilutes the values to export them.
Well, except the thing is then you have to ask the question, is democracy being cited as a way of mobilizing public opinion behind whatever policy that you're trying to put forward or to see implemented? Or is democracy a strategic goal? Is it a tactic or is it a strategy? And I'm not persuaded that they are as so devoted to democracy that they don't use it more as a tactic than as anything else. I mean, again, you have to ask, to the extent neoconservatives are supporters of a very hard right position vis-a-vis Israel, that they support Likud and even the right wing of Likud, you have to ask, well, what kinds of democratic principles does that mean the Palestinians get? And, for example, do they have the right to self-determination? And if so, under what conditions? I mean, that's a minor kind of question, but I think it's a very important question, because I'm just not entirely persuaded that they don't use democracy and democratic rhetoric as more of a tactic than as a real goal.
Where do the evangelical Christians fit with the neocons? I know there's a whole group of Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell types,
right?
Who
well, I think
led by Tom DeLay and people like him in the House.
Yeah.
Are they part of the neoconservative group, or?
No, I mean, some of them are very close to neoconservatives. Like Gary Bauer is a very close friend of Bill Kristol. And the common denominator between the Christian right and the neocons is Israel, because most leaders, or at least those we regard as leaders of the Christian right, are Christian Zionists, a movement that actually preceded Jewish Zionism, and that they believe that the reconstruction of the kingdom of David, as described in the Bible, will bring about the second coming. And so they support Israel essentially for theological reasons, to bring on the return of Christ.
I can't wait for Armageddon myself.
Well, yeah, I mean, neoconservatives, I think, all think this is pretty silly, but to the extent that the Christian right offers them real political muscle in the U.S. political system, and it certainly does, they've worked very closely with the Christian right since the late 1970s, since the Likud first took power in Israel. And it was in fact former Prime Minister Menachem Begin who gave Jerry Falwell the moral majority, the Jabotinsky Centennial Medal, which is a very big prize, in 1980, and Falwell's first private jet, so that he could reach more of his flock in the United States, because they saw the Christian right, the Likud and the neoconservatives saw the Christian right very much as very important, A, to defeating Jimmy Carter in the 1980 election, and B, as a very fertile constituency for their own, for very hardline pro-Likud ideology in the United States. Irving Kristol, there was a big debate about this in Commentary magazine, under Norman Podhoretz, was the most important neoconservative monthly journal, and there was a long debate about aligning neoconservatives or Jews in general, aligning themselves with the Christian right. And Crystal defended the Christian right option, saying, quote, it is their theology, but it is our Israel. So that regardless of how objectionable or even anti-Semitic the Christian right ideology would be, the fact that they backed Israel in such a militant fashion was the greater good. That was the argument, and that remains the argument today. So they were working together already in the late 70s, and that relationship obviously continues.
I'm getting a sense from you that ends justify the means for the greater good among these people quite often.
Yeah, I mean, they all think that although they fancy themselves idealists, they also fancy themselves realists, as they put it, in the sense that they are all students of Machiavelli, and which is not necessarily a bad thing, but they do believe that, given the hostility of the world generally, and the kind of Hobbesian vision they have of a kind of dog-eat-dog ethos, that ultimately, yes, you have to resort to things that you may not, that it may be ethically questionable, but that's just the shame. That's just the way the world is.
Okay, I think we need to get on ahead to what happened after the first Gulf War and the 1990s, and then how it's been since September 11th. I appreciate all that background on this group, these guys, however you like to call them.
Yeah. I mean, can I just go back on this last point?
Sure.
What neoconservatives now say, for example, is, hey, look, the United States had to ally itself with Stalin, who's a real pig, in order to defeat Hitler. But that was the moral thing to do. And similarly, during the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, we had to ally ourselves with horrible dictators like Pinochet, like the Argentine junta, which was as close to a Nazi government as existed since 1945, with all kinds of questionable types, in order to defeat Soviet communism. But hey, those are the kinds of alliances that are necessary in order to secure the survival of our fundamental goals of security of the United States and of Israel and of the free world. So
that brings up the question of, were any of these men involved in the creation or sustainment financing of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 80s?
Well, I mean, some were very supportive of the Mujahideen. Others really were a bit nervous about it. Neocons are not totally monolithic by any means. There's a range of opinion. Some really did try. Well, let's say that they didn't take a very visible role in championing the Mujahideen, in part because they were somewhat uncomfortable with a kind of militant Islam and the notion of jihad. But nonetheless, they were big supporters in general of what became known as the Reagan Doctrine, and the Reagan Doctrine was about supporting, in major part, the Mujahideen as the key to, crippling the Soviet Union. You'll recall, I haven't read the original material on this, but it's generally accepted that the Hamas in the West Bank and Gaza really began with the help of the Likud government in Israel, who wanted to create an alternative to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. You see the same thing, incidentally, in India, where the Indian government actually kind of helped sponsor Islamic militants in various parts of the country where they were having problems with more secular parties. So there was there's always been a tendency to play off your enemy against your enemy, and if the enemy doesn't have one, then to create another one, or to help create another one, and then back that side. And so it's not a new phenomenon.
Well, but it is still a very objectionable one, and one that isn't pointed out as much. Usually, if anything, it's all called blowback and unintended consequences, not
it's true.
intended consequences.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that, but it's not uncommon. In other words, it's not restricted to neoconservatives who do that kind of thing.
Okay, so now after the Gulf War, Paul Wolfowitz from some office in the Department of Defense, I gather, wrote some memo that caused an uproar. What was going on there?
Okay, well, he was tasked by Dick Cheney to write something called the Defense Planning Guidance. Sometimes it's called the Defense Policy Guidance. Up to the year 2000, which was essentially designed to set forth a general strategy that could then be sent to the various Pentagon bureaucracies and the commanders distributed around the world, so that they could get a sense of what was expected of them, and they could begin to budget accordingly, and to plan accordingly, and to do contingency planning accordingly. And this paper, we don't know how much Wolfowitz actually wrote it, but it was under his direction in any event. He teamed with a guy named I. Louis Libby, who also known as Scooter Libby, that's his nickname, who was then simply working directly under Wolfowitz, but who currently is Vice President Cheney's Chief of Staff and National Security Advisor, and one of the most low-key but extremely powerful players in the Bush administration's foreign policy. In any event, the memo they put forward in draft form, and which circulated within the Pentagon and went to a few other departments, called for the United States essentially to become the dominant military power throughout Eurasia. It called for doctrines of preemption, that is, to take out, either by co-optation or by confrontation, any conceivable rival that might emerge from the Eurasian area for the foreseeable future.
Which, let me stop you right there. This is really a stretch of the Webster's definition of the word preemption, right? I mean, preemption would normally mean if an enemy is on its way here, then you can preempt them. But this is really preventive war, isn't it?
Well, they didn't use those words, and preemption was used more in the sense of an immediate threat. But but the philosophy of preempting any possible rival without using the word preemption in that context ran all the way through the document. And it was directed primarily, at that time probably at Japan, but also perhaps at China, and Russia. And the idea was
Japan?
Yeah, because at that time Japan was seen as a potential strategic rival to the United States. That's when the yen was extremely powerful, and they were buying up lots of real estate and even some, big buildings in New York. And people were pretty freaked out about Japanese financial power and what it meant.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but that just threw me off for a second.
Yeah, they didn't name Japan, but that was what was kind of in the air at the time. In fact, George Bush Sr., who was then president, was even kind of let slip once about why it was important to renew ties with Vietnam. He kind of let slip that maybe it had something to do with counterbalancing Japan. I mean, that sounds bizarre given what's happened since, but it was on people's minds. That was when, Tom Clancy's book, The Rising Sun, was made into a movie about nefarious Japanese. I don't know, maybe.
Isn't that the one where the story ends with a guy kamikaze in a plane into the Capitol building?
I wasn't a big fan of the movie. I saw it once. I don't really remember. Sorry.
I don't know if they made.
But the idea was
that I read the book of. I thought it was the one where Japan was at war with the United States, and it ends with a kamikaze attack on the Capitol.
Oh, no. This was more subtle. This was at least the movie was more subtle. It was about that the Japanese are really quite serious about being a world power again, and that they were very unscrupulous and untrustworthy, and all the usual stereotypes that date back from World War II were kind of thrown in. But in any event, the idea was that it's not just that the United States would try to prevent the rise of a global rival. It was that the United States would try to prevent, or should prevent, the rise to global prominence of even a regional rival. So that, for example, if China were to become more increasingly powerful in East Asia, the United States should act against it before it might actually become a serious regional rival, let alone a global rival. So it was this notion of U.S. domination. There was very little mention, in fact, only one sentence in the whole thing, mentioned the United Nations, and basically said the United Nations is not relevant because, except to the extent we can use it, because U.S. military power would really be the ultimate guarantor of global security and peace. It called for a future in which U.S. troops would, their deployment to various troubled areas would become a, quote, constant fixture, unquote, of the international scene. So it was a very, very grandiose, very imperial in the sense of dominance, and in the sense of military power as being the ultimate arbiter of status and of power generally. It was a very aggressive document, and when it was leaked to the New York Times, it created a major controversy, and Wolfowitz and Libby were almost fired from the administration because Secretary of State Baker and National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft and a few other people who would have had to kind of go along with this and who got copies of it were outraged by its ambition and particularly kind of its bluntness about the nature of U.S. power. So eventually the DPG, as it was called, was rewritten very, very, very differently and in a much more friendly, more multilateral-oriented sort of way. But I'd maintained since shortly after the September 11th that, in fact, that had the 92 document was really the blueprint for what immediately followed September 11th, because you kind of ask yourself, well, it's terrorism in Afghanistan, so why is the United States looking to create bases all over Central Asia? I mean, one or two you definitely want access to, but actually negotiating pretty generous terms for bases. Why is it sending troops all of a sudden, Green Berets, to the Philippines? What is the relevance of that? And I think that all of this happened within like 45 days of September 11th and much more. And you say, what has this got to do with ousting the Taliban and defeating Al-Qaeda? And it didn't really make a lot of sense, except in terms of putting in place a kind of global infrastructure that would designed to ensure the kind of military dominance and access that was called for in the 92 document.
So George W. Bush really did adopt Paul Wolfowitz's plan after September 11th, then?
I mean, with some refinement, yeah. And then, of course, the national security strategy that was published in September of 92 really affirmed a number of key components of the 92 paper, as mainstream media now seems to recognize and understand that really was an important contributor to the national security document. I mean, parts of it could be lifted wholesale out of the original.
I'm being reminded here again of the Trotskyite influence that you mentioned earlier. There was the whole idea, I think, of invading Iraq, at least supposedly a big part of it was that it was going to cause this domino theory, only now instead of the Americans being scared that the communists are going to knock down a bunch of dominoes, now we're the communists knocking down dominoes, and by creating a social democracy in Iraq, that's going to inspire Iran and Syria and Saudi Arabia and everyone else to shape up their act. Is that not the neocon argument that they used to persuade for this war?
Well, I think in part, but there again, you had a number of documents that were drawn up by some of the people who would become key players in all this, both inside the administration and without the administration, and outside the administration. And these documents were written in the mid to late 90s by these people and these documents didn't talk really about democracy as being the aim. They talked in terms of transforming the balance of power in the Middle East in favor of Israel in the first instance, and thus, implicitly, of the United States as well.
And you're referring now to a clean break, right?
Well, that's one of them. There was a follow-up paper to the clean break that was written by David Wormser, which is quite detailed and much, much longer than clean break. There was a study paper done by the Middle East project, that's a Middle East Forum, and something called the U.S. Committee for the Liberation of Lebanon, with many of the same people involved in putting this together. For that matter, you have the letter written on September 20th, 2001, 9 days after the 9/11 attacks, by the Project for the New American Century, which was chaired by Bill Kristol, which laid out a program for how to conduct the war against terrorism. Didn't say anything about democracy, but it did call for the United States to topple Saddam Hussein as the second step after Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda, to topple him even if he had nothing to do with the 9/11 attack. And that was a public letter that was sent to the president and published in the Washington Times and the Weekly Standard. And it was signed by a number of people who were very, very closely associated with the people we're talking about in the administration, including Rumsfeld, Vice President Cheney, Libby, Wolfowitz, and Wolfowitz's principal deputy, Douglas Fein.
Well, and there was something written by the Project for a New American Century that anticipated with hope Pearl Harbor attacks on the American people to convince us to go to war throughout Central Asia. Isn't that right?
Well, it didn't anticipate that. It said that in order to, as I understand it, in order to get the kind of mobilization that we think is required in order to assure U.S. dominance in this century, at least for as long as possible, only a Pearl Harbor type attack would have that kind of impact. Would mobilize people in a serious way.
I read an article that you wrote, I guess just last week or maybe the week before, called Cheney's the One, about how Cheney's really the boss of foreign policy in the White House. And I'd like to understand, is it just a matter of Cheney and Rumsfeld, who apparently are typical Rockefeller Republicans, did they just join forces with the neocons, or are they officially neocons themselves now, or what?
Well, no, I think Rumsfeld is basically a Republican person who believes in peace through strength, and who's always subscribed to the idea of domination. And, I mean, I think he agrees with a lot of things that the neoconservatives have propounded, but his background, I mean, he certainly doesn't come from the left, particularly. Cheney, I think, is a more kind of interesting character. He doesn't really come from the left either. He's very much in the Rumsfeldian tradition, but I think he, for whatever reason, has come to feel as strongly about Israeli-oriented issues and alliance with Israel as the neocons. And I think some of that may actually be the influence of his wife, Lynn Cheney, who is a fellow, whose principal professional home is the American Enterprise Institute, which is really kind of neocon central in Washington. But why he feels that, it's a little mystifying, because if anything, he comes from even further right position than Rumsfeld in originally. But they're very, very close, the two of them. But I don't think they would qualify as neocons generally, because, for the most part, they don't have any. There's no left. They don't come from a left position, which is one of the things that defines neocons.
Okay, so once George Bush accepted Wolfowitz's plan, the neocons' plan for taking the war to Iraq as soon as possible, it seems like these are some of the same personalities who lied us into the war. I read an article the other day from The Nation by a guy named Robert Dreyfus, who wrote about the Office of Special Plans, which I guess we all know was created because the CIA wouldn't lie enough, and so they created the Office of Special Plans in the Pentagon. And this guy, Robert Dreyfus, writing in The Nation, says that the Office of Special Plans was actually originally created in Ariel Sharon's office. Well,
he said that, but nobody has adduced any evidence to support that. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, there's one named Karen Kwiatkowski who writes for LootRockwell.com and worked at the Pentagon, and she's at least partly corroborated this story by talking about escorting some Israelis to Douglas Feith's office, right?
Yeah, I wrote about that.
Oh,
but I don't think that, that's the only. I don't think that's necessarily evidence. It's certainly not persuasive. And I understand Bob Dreyfus was working on something more, having floated this idea in the article that you're referring to, probably about 3 months ago. And but again, nobody's written more. About that. It's certainly possible. It's certainly conceivable. Feith's law partner. Feith is the person under whom the office was set up, and Feith is a very, very right-wing, Likudnik-oriented neocon. He and his father received awards from the Zionist Organization of America, which is very right, very Likudnik in orientation, and Feith's own law partner, or former law partner, has been a spokesman for the settlers movement on the West Bank. So, you're talking about people who don't need anyone from Sharon's office to tell them what to think. They have their own ideas.
Right. If Sharon was selling them a bill of goods, they were shopping for one anyway.
But I don't know. It's conceivable that Sharon did it, but on the other hand, you have Mossad, which is under Sharon's authority, basically publicly, people associated with Mossad, publicly ridiculing the notion that Saddam was involved with 9/11, and ridiculing the idea that Saddam and Al-Qaeda would be cooperating. So if it did come out of Israel, it would have had to have been done on a more or less informal or unofficial basis, because the Israeli intelligence agencies thought all of this was a joke.
Well, the same could be said for the United States, right? The CIA thought this was all a joke, too, which is why they set up the Office of Special Plans in the Pentagon, right?
Well, yeah, it's clear that they kind of wanted to flood the zone with information. If you look at the people who were saying consistently that Saddam's hand could be seen in 9/11, it was mainly people outside the administration, but who nonetheless were extremely closely associated with the major figures in the administration who were arguing for war. And then especially members of the Defense Policy Board, like Richard Pearl and James Woolsey, and Ken Edelman, among a few. And then you've got the Weekly Standard kind of arguing the same line, Bill Kristol in particular. These guys were all pointing at Saddam Hussein within 24 hours of 9/11, even before the dust pretty much settled, that they were all saying Saddam must be involved. Now, the administration figures were somewhat more cautious about what they said on that question, but they didn't need to be right out there because they had Pearl and Woolsey and others repeating that endlessly on Fox News and through other media.
Oh, which brings up the question I was just about to say. They had Rupert Murdoch repeating it for them. Is he an official member of this neocon group, or
actually, I don't really?
Close?
I mean, he obviously must be sympathetic to a lot of the ideas because he wouldn't be financing the Weekly Standard.
Oh, he owns the Weekly Standard too, not just Fox News.
Oh yeah. No, Weekly Standard wouldn't exist without Murdoch. It's a Murdoch publication.
And again, he's a foreigner, right? He's not an American.
He's a Brit, isn't he?
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to make sure and get that out. That patriotism means loyalty to the British first, I guess.
Well, you can still think that the interests of all concerned are completely compatible. I mean, that is a position that you can hold.
Okay, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about the Reconstruction. The war was over pretty quick, but once it was over, there were big splits and fights within the administration about the Reconstruction in Iraq as far as who would run it, what role Chalabi and the Iraqi National Congress would have in the new government, etc. And apparently it all turned into a giant mess, and now Bush has taken control away from Rumsfeld and given it to Condoleezza Rice. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't know that he has. I know that there's a new office, but I don't know what it does. I mean, and so far as I know, the Pentagon is still the person that Jerry Bremer reports to, and Feist in particular is the person. So this is one of the reasons why I wrote the article about Cheney being the one, incidentally, because something that came out in an article written in the Washington Post that hadn't been reported before a couple of weeks ago concerned specifically Chalabi. That Bush had given, at the beginning of the war, had told everybody he did not want any one Iraqi faction to be favored over any other. And then the Pentagon flies in Chalabi and 600 armed followers into southern Iraq shortly after they secure Nasiriyah in the south. And what the Post reported is that this was done under Cheney's authority, which suggests that Cheney was acting in contradiction to what the president had directed. Unless, Bush changed his mind and nobody else knew about it. And I think that's essentially what has happened. One of the problems is that you have a national security apparatus which is supposed to be coordinated by Condoleezza Rice. But from what I've been able to glean and from what my talks with people who are in a position to know much better is that Rice just has not acted in a way to coordinate much of anything and has, as a result, been constantly circumvented by Rumsfeld and by Cheney, and in particular, by Cheney's national security advisor, Louis Libby, who is a very powerful, smart operator. And thus, when it's announced that Rice is now going to head a new organization that's going to take authority away from the Pentagon, well, I mean, yeah, maybe, but what's the evidence? And what does it mean on the ground? And it's maybe much too early to tell. And Rice has recently taken on her staff a guy named Robert Blackwell, who used to be ambassador to India, who's a very, knowledgeable, smart, bureaucratic, smart kind of guy. And it's going to be his job to assert the national security advisor's position within the administration and to act as a serious national security advisor, which hasn't taken place as yet, to empower the National Security Council.
So the fact that she's hired him makes it seem like maybe she is actually serious about trying to take control of the situation then?
Well, I think that she feels in many ways humiliated by what has taken place, but I don't know her personally at all. I mean, if I were her, I would. I don't see what impact she's had on policy and on the running of a policy that to me is like out of control. I mean, would you want to be Bush running on the situation that we appears to be the case in Iraq today? And how did we get there? And worse, how do you get out? I mean, none of these things really have been thought through. And as Rumsfeld's memo, which was disclosed by USA Today last week, showed, I mean, the people who are supposed to have all the answers, in fact, are asking such fundamental questions that you have to, like, for example, how do we measure whether we're winning the war on terror? I mean, one would have thought that somebody with Rumsfeld's and Cheney's business experience would have tried to devise those memberships before those measures before they invaded Iraq.
Yeah, it's
and
2
not
years
6 months later. Yeah.
2 years after September 11th, we're now looking for the metrics by which to measure how we're winning?
Yeah, precisely. And I mean, that raises, like, very, very serious questions. And you have to ask yourself, if the Pentagon wasn't devising the measures, where was the National Security Advisor? Why wasn't the National Security Advisor saying, we need to establish benchmarks to determine if we're going in the right direction? We need benchmarks. Get me benchmarks. And that should have been done, as you say, 2 years ago.
Sometimes I wonder if she's just there for public relations reasons.
Well, I think she's there because she gets along extremely well with George W. And she clearly has, he listens very carefully to her. But I think ultimately he listens more carefully to Cheney. And I think, that he does and has done pretty much what Cheney has recommended since 9/11. Before 9/11, it was more evenly matched between, like, Powell and Cheney and Rumsfeld. But since 9/11, I think he's deferred to Cheney's view. That's my sense of it. And I think that the kinds of operations you're talking about, the Office of Special Plans and all of that, has not just been protected and authorized by Rumsfeld. I think it's been protected and authorized by Cheney, where it was Cheney and Libby running interference. Because, frankly, the British have been asking for Feist to be fired for 6 months as Undersecretary for Policy. And you have to ask yourself, why is he still there? I mean, this is a guy who was supposed to plan the post-war scenario, which, by all accounts, is not the way it has turned out to be. So why, particularly if the British are asking for his head, why is he still there?
Well, he's still there because if they fired anybody, then they'd have to admit that they did anything wrong, and everybody knows that everything's going exactly according to plan.
Yeah, but Feist is low enough down that it wouldn't have the impact of, say, firing Wolfowitz. Feist is not a name that's on everybody's lips in Washington. And you could do it, and you could satisfy the Brits, and you could, why is that? I don't understand that.
Actually, that was going to be my next question for you is, you just described when you were asking about would you want to run for president in a situation like this where you have no exit strategy and American soldiers are dying every day. And I was going to ask you, it doesn't seem to me like the neocons are losing grip on their positions of power in the White House at all. I mean, this guy Wormser just got promoted, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was the author of the 96 Clean Break paper and then a subsequent paper. And he's had Syria in his sights for the better part of 10 years. In fact, in his view, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein was simply a tactic designed to eliminate the Assad regime in Syria, if not completely redraw Syria in ways that, the major governing entities would be tribes and clans rather than a central government. Something that he thinks should apply to the entire Arab Mideast. He's just been brought on to Cheney's staff, and this man has, as I said, he's had Syria on the brain. And I think that in many ways the neoconservatives won a major strategic battle when they got U.S. troops on the ground in Iraq, because once there, then you do begin to have enormous repercussions for the rest of the region and for U.S. policy toward the rest of the region. And that's why I think Sharon has been so aggressive, unexpectedly aggressive with respect to Syria, is he's drawing the rest of the circle. I think there's an attempt to have the United States military forces seeing the world very much as Likud sees it. Neocons have always seen the enemies of the United States and the enemies of Israel as the same. And this is a way of bringing the two closer to convergence. It's just to get them on the ground in the middle of the Arab world. Because then it becomes highly desirable to the United States, perhaps, to get rid of Assad. It might.
So it seems like maybe they decided to just go ahead, and even though this is a disaster in Iraq so far, might as well carry out the rest of the disaster to Syria and Saudi Arabia and whoever else while we're there.
Well, they may not see it as a disaster, though. I don't know that they're totally cynical either. I think some probably are, but others may not be. And they think that we really can, improve the lives of everybody there. And I certainly wouldn't defend Saddam Hussein's rule, because I think he was a tyrant who should have been overthrown long ago, though not necessarily by U.S. forces. But putting that aside, I think there's a lot of forward momentum that's been built in to the situation of our being now in Iraq. We do want the borders with Syria closed. If Syria can't close those borders, and incidentally, Syria can't close those borders, because in many cases it's impossible to believe, then we will get angry at Syria. And thus, when Sharon attacked the alleged Palestinian training camp near Damascus, for the first Israeli attack on Syrian territory in 30 years, quite significant. And then the U.S., or Bush in particular, defends the action as legitimate self-defense. And then the U.S. vetoes a UN resolution deploring the attack. You're moving very close to an identity, to really, indeed, having a strategic alliance.
Sure, and in the minds of the American people, you can just rub Al-Qaeda and Islamic Jihad and Hamas and Hezbollah all into one big group and say, well, it's a war on terrorism, right? We got to take on all terrorists anywhere.
Well, it's interesting because one of these, in Washington, there's another organization that's not heard of so much nationally, but it's very active in Washington. It's called the Foundation for Defending Democracy, for the Defense of Democracy. And it ran a 30-second television ad in the Washington area repeatedly during the spring of 2002. And now it's begun to do something similar again, which essentially used very sophisticated camera kind of techniques to identify bin Laden with Saddam Hussein with Arafat, with the implication being it's all one terrorist, and we face the same terrorists that Israel has been facing for so long. The ad was called the Suicide Strategy. And as I say, they've just begun running them again in the Washington area. Now, who is the person who put this film together? He's a former press attaché at the Israeli embassy here. It's run by a guy named Clifford May. On the board of this organization are all the people you would expect, from Pearl to Gene Kirkpatrick and Woolsey and so on. As I said, the head of this organization is Clifford May, who's a former New York Times correspondent who then was a spokesman for the Republican National Committee. And interesting, it's Clifford May who said shortly after Robert Novak wrote that column which identified Wilson's wife as a CIA operative. It was Clifford May who wrote something in the National Review several days later saying, well, what's all this uproar about? I've known who Valerie Plame, I've been informed by people outside the administration who Valerie Plame is. It wasn't a secret to me. What's the big deal? Which I just found I almost fell over when I saw that because, if I were now the FBI, I'd be knocking down Clifford May's, door and saying, well, who told you? Because May is not, although he writes a column now and again, he's not a journalist like Novak. And they would have every right to ask him, who told him? And I'll bet that it's the same people who are closely associated with whoever it was in the White House who told Robert Novak. I mean, that's kind of how the network works.
Yeah, it's quite a network.
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm sorry. We're almost out of time here, but you did bring up the Wilson and Plame thing real quick. And I just want to ask you, did you read the recent Hirsch article in the New Yorker where he says that perhaps CIA agents were the ones mad CIA agents were the ones who forged the Niger uranium documents just to embarrass the Office of Special Plans guys?
Retired CIA.
Oh, retired CIA guys.
Yeah. Yeah, I read it. Yeah.
What do you think of that?
I thought it was
Sound
very
credible or not? Likely or not?
I don't know. I guess it's conceivable. I don't know. I would have actually thought that they probably came from some volunteers. And the fact that they came out of Italy was particularly suspicious to me because Italy has just been a fount of the Italian intelligence services has been a fount of bad documents and disinformation for decades. One of the very hardcore neocons actually had a formal consultancy with the Italian military intelligence, which is what it came from, or what it's rumored to have come from. And that was Michael Ledeen.
Oh, Michael Ledeen. I knew I was going to forget to ask you about somebody or something during this interview. Now, he's not so much a former socialist as he is a former fascist, right?
Well, I don't know that much, about his early stuff. I'm waiting to get something that he wrote when he was pretty young about Mussolini. But he's had a certain, I couldn't comment on his early, political thinking. I know that his associations in Italy were subject of a number of interesting investigations, among them by the late Jonathan Whitney at the Wall Street Journal, who said that Ledeen was tied to the P2 Lodge and scandal of the early 80s, or late 70s, early 80s, which was very, very damaging. And, of course, he was involved in Iran-Contra.
And now what was that scandal again, the P2 Lodge?
Well, essentially the Christian Democrats in Italy, which ran Italy for many, many years, had a certain dark side, and it in which they were tied to the mafia in certain ways, but they had larger kind of multinational interests. And it all gets very, very Machiavellian, but there were a number of scandals which exposed the existence of something called the P2 Lodge, which was a Masonic lodge of Masons in Italy that had enormous influence in who got where in Italy and who got what contracts in Italy and outside Italy, and had many, many kind of nefarious connections. One of the principal figures who was in prison in the United States for quite some time named Ledeen as kind of a player in the P2 Lodge, although he would have been quite young at the time. And it all has a certain... There's an air of tremendous mystery and conspiracy around the P2 Lodge. And if you go to Italy and you ask people about it, they still kind of shudder about kind of the implications of the existence of this group. Essentially, it was a very, very powerful small group of people.
Sort of like the Skull and Bones in the United States.
Well, that I can't speak to because I know nothing about the Skulls, except that I know the Bushes were inducted into Skull and Bones. But these were people who met on an ongoing basis and who decided policy and who would get where. And it all kind of became a major thing when one of the characters was found hung from Blackfriars. Oh, it was Blackfriars. I can't remember the name of the bridge in London. And there was a big question as to whether they had done it deliberately, or whether he'd been murdered, and what were the reasons. And it was all associated with P2 Lodge and many, many, many hundreds of millions of dollars that were being moved around from Vatican accounts. There was a Vatican connection that was very unseemly and deeply embarrassing to the church. It's Italian politics exists in its own little world. But Ledeen, it is alleged, kind of definitely flitted around it if he was not even in the middle of it.
Oh, Mr. Lobe, I wish I had another hour to continue this, but we're about out of time. Do you have any closing comments or anything?
No.
No closing comments?
No, I don't. I think, the neoconservative phenomenon is something that deserves a lot of study and a lot of attention by people, because this really is a very small group of people which has been getting its way because they're very politically well-connected. They have a good political sense, and they're skilled bureaucratically and within the media. And really, their agendas are the ones that have been pretty much followed in the war on terror, and that's why they deserve so much attention. At the same time, I don't see them as a conspiracy, because what they do is pretty open. They've left a very big paper trail, and that's what I think people should be paying attention to. If they want to know where things are going, they should be reading some of the documents that we were talking about in this conversation, and then keeping up with where these various people are in and around the administration, and that will tell them a lot, I think, about kind of where we're going, at least under this administration.
Thank you very much. And by the way, you can all look up Jim Lobe's archives at ipsnews.net/focus/neocons, and there's a dash in neocons there. That's ipsnews.net/focus/neocons. Jim Lobe, Chief of InterPress Services, Washington, D.C. Bureau. Thank you so much for coming on the air today, sir.
Sure, it's a pleasure.